and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You want answers?
You have offended my family.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth.
And you have offended Shaolin Temple.
You can't handle the truth.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Radical Rant.
Oh boy, folks, after we got done with the show yesterday, I got a tweet from John Doe at John Doe Radio that he was streaming live the hearings in the Colorado committee hearings in the House there, House Judiciary, I think it was. Anyway, it was a hearing on the House Bill 1261, which is the bill to enact a 5 nanogram per milliliter THC in the blood per se DUID limit. And that's a big fancy way of saying if we think you're stoned, we'll test your blood, and if your blood comes up more than 5 nanograms of THC in the blood per milliliter, you are a drunk driver. You are a drugged driver. You're impaired. You're guilty. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200, right? And there's a lot of controversy regarding this bill, and we'll get to some of that in hour two. But first, I wanted to start by highlighting some of the testimony that was there at the hearing, because as I'm watching the tweets come through, I myself didn't listen to it at first because I knew it just make my blood boil, and I was going to go to a comedy show. So
made my blood boil.
Yeah, so I didn't want to get myself, mess up my vibe. But it went kind of the way I interpreted, and it's kind of one of the things that we've got in the medical marijuana states is that we've been successful, and it's kind of brought out many people to claim that they're activists and to testify in favor of these things. That sometimes you have this feeling like with friends like these, who needs enemies? And that's kind of what we're going to take a look at here. Let's start though with one of the silly things. This is one from about crossing the eyes. This is one of the I believe the law enforcement or somebody was testifying in favor of the bill and talking about how we could detect whether or not someone was too stoned to drive.
Sergeant Craig Simpson.
There are other tests which officers can perform that may help them to make this determination. Tests such as one called lack of convergence, which looks to see whether or not a person is able to cross their eyes. Marijuana is a drug that prevents a person from being able to cross their eyes. Interestingly, it is the only drug category that doesn't allow a person to cross their eyes, and also does not allow the person to exhibit a jerkiness of their eye. So it's a unique drug in that sense that is the only one to provide that influence.
Okay, Officer Simpson, let's demonstrate.
That man just smoked some hash. He can do it.
All right, I think we've debunked that one. Let's go to this next clip here. We've got, let's go with Paul Serini. Paul Serini was the person who up until recently ran marijuanaradio.com, if I'm not mistaken. And, well, let's just let him speak for himself.
Good evening. My name is Paul Serini, and I'm here for myself. I'm a philosopher, but I wear many professional hats to manage my company and my business.
That's all we needed to know.
I'm also
that was
a philosopher.
Marijuana user.
Yeah. If you want people to take you seriously, Paul, don't say that you majored in something where burger flippers are there.
Yeah, I'm a philosopher. Like, thanks for the testimony, Socrates.
Yeah. Not many people were paying attention to you after that.
Yeah. It kind of makes you trail off there, but interesting that that's how you'd want to represent yourself. Now, Attorney Lauren Davis also testified, and John Doe, Tim Martin at John Doe Radio said that, if we all had our stuff together like this lady does, as far as coming forth and representing and being polite and on top of your statistics, that this would be someone to model. So let's check it out.
Good evening. My name is Lauren Davis, and I'm an attorney who has both prosecuted and defended hundreds of DUI and DUID cases. I have substantial concerns about the 5 nanogram limit that is proposed in this bill. Now, as a trial attorney who has substantial experience in these cases, I would argue that the current law is sufficient. It allows the prosecutor to exercise appropriate discretion to look at the real issue that you're concerned about, and that is the driver's performance impaired as demonstrated by their driving? I believe that this proposal is based on a lack of understanding about the practical realities of DUI prosecution and the awful consequences that will flow from the individuals who are prosecuted under a per se law. But that said, my instinct is that the legislature is going to pass a per se limit, and if you are going to do that, I strongly, strongly urge you to look at a higher limit. I don't believe that this presumption of 5 nanograms is an absolute. While I respect Ms. Burback and some of the individuals who are here, I think what you're not hearing, and you've heard it from members of the medical marijuana community, but I'd urge you to look at the substantial amounts of conflicting evidence and the statements from our National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that says that the blood test from a single test does not accurately reflect actual intoxication. It doesn't account for factors such as frequency of use, tolerance, and a number of other things. And the NHTSA has concluded that it's inadvisable to predict effects of impairment based on blood concentration alone. What is uncontroverted by pretty much any study is that the effect of THC on impairment is highly variable from individual. It depends on frequency of use. And another thing you haven't heard is that studies show that heavy users have detectable amounts of THC that are almost twice the amounts as occasional users. So a heavy user will have lingering effects in their system for significantly longer. I believe your 5 nanogram limit is going to criminalize non-criminal conduct. I want to turn to the issue of probable cause to bring this to what the reality is in the courtroom. Probable cause.
Okay, just want to fade out for there because I got to address a few points in that. And first of all, this idea that those of us who are habitual, chronic, heavy users of cannabis are going to have detectable limits of THC within the blood that would trip a 5 nanogram per milliliter limit. And then the other part of that, of course, is that whether or not someone who has a 5 nanogram per milliliter THC in the blood is in fact too impaired to drive. And so, you know, we've gotten a lot of correspondence on this subject. And one of the things about working for NORML and being here representing NORML is we've always had a no driving policy. We've always said responsible users do not smoke marijuana and then drive. And the thing is, too, is we always want to be honest brokers of the science and the facts, even if the science and the facts don't necessarily make our case or make us look good. You know, we're not going to obfuscate or try to tell half-truths here. We're going to be absolutely honest about what the science shows. And the science shows, the reliable studies show, that a 5 nanogram per milliliter of THC detected in the blood is fairly indicative of marijuana use within 1 to 3 hours. We're not talking about p-tests. We're not talking about metabolites where they can be detected for days or weeks. We are talking about THC in the blood, nanograms of milliliter THC in the blood. For the vast majority of marijuana users, smoking pot will spike your blood THC over 5 nanograms per milliliter after you recently smoke, and that level will usually drop below that threshold within a few hours. So if you're smoking every hour, then perhaps you are up above a 5 nanogram per milliliter limit. But I think that's what the legislature is trying to address here, is the idea that someone who is smoking marijuana all the time would then get behind the wheel. So the second question here is whether or not someone who is smoking marijuana all the time and is above 5 nanograms is impaired. Now, once again, reliable studies will show that 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood THC will put most tokers into a state of psychomotor impairment compared to non-smoking controls. In other words, you are not as good or better a driver when stoned as you are when sober. But the question is, how bad a driver are you? Now, you may not be 100% of your driving ability, but is your 80% or is your 90% too dangerous to allow you on the road? And this is something I always bring up when we talk about this, because she does make a good point there, is that just because we detect 5 nanograms per milliliter in your blood doesn't mean that you're necessarily a big danger or risk on the road. We don't see a correlation to accident statistics, for example, with marijuana drivers. But to say that someone at 5 nanograms isn't impaired compared to not smoking, well, that's just not the case. If you have used marijuana, you are impaired compared to if you hadn't been smoking marijuana. Now, this always brings me to an interesting point. A bottle of Marinol, right, the synthetic THC, has a warning on it that says, until you know how dronabinol may affect you, do not drive or operate heavy machinery. Which kind of says to me, once you do know how it affects you, go ahead and drive, right? So if that's for 100% synthetic THC, then we're talking 10 to 20% plant THC, then shouldn't you be able to, if you know how it affects you, be able to drive on it? And there's all sorts of other pharmaceuticals where we allow people, you know, the same leeway. We're not calling for testing for nanograms per milliliter of Vicodin in someone's system, for example, or antihistamines in someone's system, for example. These kind of things that can also impair driving performance. another thing to think about this too is that the same studies that show impairment also show that impairment is equal or lesser than drivers who have a 0.05 blood alcohol content. And we don't automatically consider them too impaired to drive. But here's where we run into a political difficulty. What the legislatures are looking for is not the crime of whether or not your use is going to cause a wreck or too much impairment. It's that you used and then went and drove. See, the idea isn't that we have an absolute scale, we have a relative scale. So say you're an A+ driver and some 80-year-old is a C- driver. The crime is that you are impairing yourself. You're dropping your A+ down to an A-, not that you're worse than the C- driver, right? The idea here is that you're not making every effort you can to be as sober as you can, to be as least of a risk as you can to the other drivers on the road. We'll talk a little bit more about this in Toker Talk Radio Hour 2. The calls will be open at 971-533-7111 if you want to be heard, and we'll play some more clips for you. For Ganja John and Cannabis Carry, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. We'll be talking to you next week, and until next time, take care of each other, Tokers.
We love the earth.
This is Normal Show Live, the voice of the marijuana nation.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.